All right, today we're going to be going over our new section 9.3, and it's just another way to solve quadratic functions. Last week we talked about you could solve them by graphing them, and that was just when you graphed the parabola, you saw where it was crossing the x-axis. And just a refresher, remember it could have been crossing the x-axis in two places. It could have just been touching that x-axis, or maybe it wasn't touching it at all. So you could have two solutions, you could have one solution, or you could have no solution. So no matter which method you use to solve, those are always your possibilities. 2, 1, or none for your solutions. Okay, so for a square root method, what we're talking about this week, we just have to remember our square root symbol. Remember, it looks like this. So that means we're going to end up with something like x squared equals 4. And when that happens, we don't want an x squared, we want an x by itself to figure out what it is equal to. So the inverse operation of squaring something is to take its square root. So to get rid of that squared, we're going to take the square root. But what we do to one side, remember, we have to do to the other. So this square root and the squared will cancel, leaving us with just our x. And then the square root of 4, a lot of you are going to tell me is 2, which is halfway correct. But we did this back in Unit 7, where we talked about radicals and rational exponents. And we did a lot in radicals, and we talked about when you're taking the square root of something, it's going to always have a positive and a negative root. So 2 squared is 4. Negative 2 squared is also 4. So we would have two solutions there. So that's just a little refresher for the square root method. The zero of a function, nothing new here. We've been talking about this since Unit 4. A zero is also called a root, a solution, and an x-intercept. Okay, so they could ask what is the solution to the problem. They could ask what is the root of the problem. They could ask what is the zero. They're asking the same thing. Where does this cross the x-axis? Okay, this next section down here, it's just telling you when you're going to have no solution, one solution, or two solutions. Okay, so you have to get the x squared by itself. Notice it's like that on all three examples. But if your d is greater than 0, which numbers greater than 0 are going to be positive numbers, right? So if your x squared is equal to a positive number, you're going to have two solutions. You're going to have that positive and that negative. If d is a 0, like if this was x squared equals a 0, it's only going to have one solution. And in this case, it would just be 0. So it'd be crossing or touching at the origin. Then our last case, if d is less than 0, which those are negative numbers, so x squared equals a negative number, you're going to have no solution. Remember, you cannot take the square root of a negative number. So you can write it as this no solution symbol here, or write out no solutions. So let's look at some extra practice. We're going to solve the equation using square roots. So we want to first make this to where this is x squared equals, and then everything else is over here. We want the x squared to be by itself. So looking at number 1, I have my x squared right here, but I have this plus 49 with it. So I need to move that plus 49 to the other side of the equal sign. How do I do that? Good, we're going to subtract 49. What we do to one side, we do to the other. So I'm going to subtract my 49 over here, which leaves me with x squared equals, and then 0 minus 49 is just negative 49. Then my next step, since my x squared is by itself, would be to get rid of that squared. So I would want to take the square root of both sides. If you remember what we just talked about up here, if your d is negative, which what we're equal to is negative, then there's not going to be a solution. Notice down here, our x squared is equal to a negative 49. So this is going to be no solution. Now let's say you didn't recognize that and you wanted to go ahead and take the square root of 49. I would use your calculator. So I'm going to my 84 app, which should be on the Chromebook if you have the school issued one. If not, go to that website we used in 9.2. And I'm going to put in the square root, which is second x squared, and then I'm going to do negative 49. And when I hit enter, it's going to give me an error. No real answers. It's because nothing times itself was going to give us that negative 49. So if you get this error, I would first make sure you did your math right, that you ended up with the negative correctly, and then the answer would just be no solution. Okay, so let's look at number 2. X squared minus 25 equals 0. Okay, so I want to first get my x squared by itself. So it has this minus 25. How do I undo minus 25? Good, I'm going to add the 25. What I do to one side, I do to the other. So I get x squared equals 0 plus 25 is 25. Since my x squared is by itself and the 25 is positive, I know I'm going to have a solution, so I'm going to keep going. To get rid of the squared on my x, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So the square root and the squared will eliminate, cancel each other out, give me an x. And the square root of 25, a lot of you are going to say, oh, that's a 5. But remember, if this is a positive number that we're taking the square root of, you're going to have a positive 5 and a negative 5. And you can write them separately, like 5 comma negative 5, or you can write them with that plus minus sign. It doesn't matter. Okay, number 3. We have x squared plus 6 equals 6. So again, we want this x squared by itself. So we need to move this plus 6. How do we move plus 6? Awesome. We're going to subtract the 6. So I get x squared equals 6 minus 6 is 0. Now we just want an x squared. We just want an x on an x squared. So to get rid of that squared, we're going to take the square root. Well, taking the square root and squaring undo each other. So this is just an x over here. Then the square root of 0 is 0. And we know there's not going to be a plus or minus sign here because 0 is neither positive nor negative. And then also up here on the second one, it talked about if your d is a 0, then you're only going to have one solution, which is a 0. Okay, number 4, we have 2x squared plus 84 equals 0. So again, we want to start getting the x squared by itself first. Notice that it's not just an x squared anymore. We have this 2 in front of it also. But we still want to move whatever we're adding or subtracting first. So my very first step is I want to move that plus 84. So to undo plus 84, we're going to subtract 84. What we do to one side, we do to the other. So on the left side, I'm just left with my 2x squared. Then on the right side, 0 minus 84, well, that's a negative 84. Okay, then my next step is not to square root because I still have this 2 in front of my x squared. So 2 right next to the x squared, remember that operation means multiply. I don't see a plus or minus sign between the 2 or the x squared. So I'm multiplying them together. So the inverse of multiply is divide. So I'm going to divide everything by that 2 because I want that to eliminate to give me just that 1x squared. Then negative 84 divided by 2 is going to give us a negative 42. Then the next step to solve, I would want to take the square root of both sides because I want this squared and square root to cancel each other out. But notice over here, square root of a negative 42. What happens if you're taking the square root of a negative? Good, it's just like that number 1 example. You're going to get no solution. And if you need to put it in the calculator, put it in the calculator. Okay, number 5. First, I'll need to get my x squared by itself, so I always want to undo the add or subtract first. So I'm going to undo this minus 12 by adding 12. So on the left, I have this negative x squared. On the right, negative 12 plus 12, well, that just gives me a 0. And then I have a lot of students who are going to want to take the square root right here, but we have this negative in front of the x squared. What number is really there? A negative 1, that's right. So just like over on number 4, when you had that 2x squared, what did we do to that 2 to get rid of it? We divided. Same thing here. We're going to divide by this negative 1 because we don't want anything with our x, okay? So I get x squared equals, then 0 divided by negative 1, well, 0 divided by anything is 0. Then our final step, I want to get that squared off of our x, so square root both sides. So I get x is equal to, the square root of 0 is just 0. Number 6, 81x squared minus 49 equals negative 24. So again, our very first step is we want to get this x squared by itself. So I want to move my minus 49 first. How do I do that? Good. We're going to add our 49 to both sides. So now I have 81x squared equals negative 24 plus 49. Now, some of you have a hard time dealing with negatives and positives. Use your calculator. There's no shame in the calculator game, guys. Go to your calculator and do negative 24 plus 49. Okay? You want to make sure you're doing the math correctly with those positive and negative numbers. So we get a positive 25. Then the next step, to get that x squared by itself, it has that 81 out front. So there's no add or subtract sign between them. So what operation is that? Do you remember? Good, it's multiply. So to undo multiply, we're going to divide. So on the left, I have my x squared. Then on the right, I have 25 divided by 81. So again, use your calculator. No matter which calculator you're using, they all will simplify this for you. So I'm going to do 25 divided by 81, and it's going to give me this weird decimal. So I'm going to hit math, enter, enter, to make that decimal a fraction. So since it gives me a 25 over 81 again, that's it. I can't reduce this at all. So my x squared is just going to stay 25 over 81. We don't want to put it as a decimal. Okay, we're still not finished. We still have the squared attached to that x. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to get rid of that squared by taking the square root. So square root and squared will cancel each other out, leaving us with just an x over here. Then you have a few options here. This square root of 25 over 81, you can rewrite as the square root of 25 over the square root of 81. You can separate them because you should know the square root of 25 is 5 and the square root of 81 is 9. Or you could use your calculator. And I'm going to do alpha y equals first I'm going to do the square root. So second x squared. Then alpha y equals enter to put my fraction in there. 25 in the top, 81 in the denominator. Hit enter. Notice it gives me 5 over 9, which is what I got when I broke it into two separate square roots. So it doesn't matter. Either way works. But since we're taking the square root of this positive number, it's not just 5 over 9. It is positive and negative 5 over 9. Don't forget that. Okay, let's look at number 7. Number 7, we have 16x squared minus 1 equals 0. So again, the first thing we're going to do is move our add or subtract. So I have a minus 1 here. So to move it, I'm going to add 1 to both sides of my equal sign. So I get 16x squared equals 1. My x squared still isn't by itself. It has this 16 in front of it. When it's in front of it without a plus or a minus sign between, that means multiply. So we're going to divide by 16 on both sides. So I get x squared equals 1 over 16. Now, from here, you can do either step that we did on number 6. You can separate it like we did over here, or you can just put it in the calculator 1 over 16. Okay, so that's up to you, whichever method you want to use. So square root both sides. If I take the square root of 1 and take the square root of 16 without using my calculator, I can do that. Or use your calculator, doesn't matter. Either way, I know that there's going to be a positive and a negative. The square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 16 is 4. So our answers would be positive and negative 1/4. Okay, I want you to pause the video and do number 8 and number 9. Try them on your own, and then you'll unpause the video and check your answers. All right, so on number 8, the first thing you should have done is subtract 16 from both sides. So you get a negative 3x squared equals a negative 27. Then we should divide both sides by negative 3. So x squared equals a negative divided by negative is a positive, positive 9. Our next step, we're going to take the square root. Since I'm taking the square root of a positive, I know I should have a plus and a minus 3. Okay, check yourself, see how you did on that one. Number 9. This one was a little tricky because the x squared wasn't the first term. So looking at this, this 16 is really a positive 16. So if I want to move that, I need to do the opposite, which is to make it negative. So subtract. Now this negative is still with that 2x squared. And 16 minus 16 gives me a 0. So I have a negative 2x squared equals 0. To get that negative 2 off the x squared, I'm going to divide by negative 2. So I have x squared equals 0 divided by anything is 0. In my final step, I want to get the x by itself by eliminating the squared. So I'm going to take the square root. The square root of 0 is 0. So I have one solution and it's 0. Okay, so this is a lot of chapter 1, moving things around the equation. That's the very first thing we learned. And then once you get the x squared by itself, you're taking the square root, and do not forget that positive and negative, okay? We are not going to assign problems like this. If we were in class, I probably would. But since we're not, I'm going to keep it as basic as I can. That way it's going to be easier for you guys. So let's move on to number 16 through 21. It says to solve using square roots, round your solutions to the nearest hundredth. So notice in the directions it says to round to the nearest hundredth. So we're going to be using our calculators. So the same steps as before. I'm going to start by getting the x squared by itself. So on number 16, I'm going to subtract my 6 from both sides of my equal sign. So I get x squared equals 8 minus 6 is 2. Then my next step to get x squared, the squared off of my x, is I'm going to take the square root. So square root and squared will cancel. So I get x equals the square root of 2. 2 is a positive number, so there's going to be a positive and a negative. And be careful, I have a lot of students that want to say the square root of 2 is 1. 1 times 1 is not 2, guys, so be careful. I'm going to go to my calculator and take the square root of 2. And I get that beautiful decimal right there. And remember, they want us to round to the nearest hundredth. Okay, so the hundredth is your 2 places after the decimal. So 2 places after the decimal here is the 1. So I have to look at the next number, that next 4, to tell me, does that 1 stay a 1 or does it go up to a 2? Well, 4 and under, it's going to stay. So our answer would be plus or minus 1.41. Okay, so same thing that we've been doing. I think on this one, what's going to hurt is the rounding. Some of you have a hard time with rounding. So on 17, we'll do one more. I would add my 12 to both sides. So I would get x squared equals 15. Then to get the x by itself, I'm going to take the square root. When I do that, I just get x equals the square root of 15. 15 is a positive number, so I'm going to have two solutions, one positive and one negative. So I'm going to take the square root of 15 in my calculator. 3.872. That 7 is in the hundredths place, so I look at the 2. The 2 is less than 5, so the 7 stays a 7, so 3.87. Okay, so I think these kinds of problems are pretty easy. As long as you can get the x by itself and plug it in the calculator and then round. Now, it may not always be hundredths, so make sure you're reading the directions on your assignments where they want you to round. And if they don't say round, you get to pick. And I would pick at least the tenths place. I wouldn't round to the nearest whole number. Anyways, if y'all have any questions, remember my Google Meets. I'm going to be on there Monday and Tuesday at pretty much all day, 10:30 to I think it's 2. Just look at my office hours on that blue information sheet that's on your Google Classroom page. Or you can text me or call me at that number that's listed on that page as well. You can always email me. I've had quite a few of you in the last couple of days reach out in private messaging through Google Classroom. So you can do that. And I'm here all the time. I was responding to some private messages like at 11:30 the other night. So don't worry about if it's late or not. It's not going to bother me. I hope you guys are enjoying your time at home and staying safe and staying healthy. And I'm here if you need me.